There's a town nestled deep in rural America, where the roads are quiet, the people are polite, and the past is buried deeper than the graves behind the old church. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and no one talks about what happened one night in the summer of 1979. A teenage girl disappeared without a trace. Her body was found 3 days later in the woods, wrapped in a bedsheet, her wrists tied with phone cord. No signs of struggle, no suspects, just whispers. The local sheriff blamed drifters. The town prayed and moved on. But those who were there, those who lived it, know better. Because the killer wasn't a stranger. The killer was one of them. For over 4 decades, the truth stayed hidden behind smiles, silence, and Southern hospitality. Files went missing. Witnesses forgot. And every few years, someone else who knew too much died too soon. This is the story they never wanted told. A murder buried in layers of secrets, stitched together by fear, loyalty, and lies. But the truth has a way of clawing its way back, especially when you start digging. Welcome to Murderland, a place where justice sleeps and ghosts don't forget. In the summer of 1979, nestled somewhere between the pine-covered ridges of western Kentucky and the slow-moving bends of the Mississippi River, was a town so small it didn't appear on most maps, yet so self-contained that few ever needed to leave it. Ashwood, population 3,612, where time ticked just a bit slower, where front porches doubled as confessionals and secrets traveled no farther than the church pews on Sunday mornings. A town with one diner, one gas station, 2 bars that shared the same jukebox, and a local sheriff who'd spent more time fishing than writing reports. But beneath that calm, nostalgic surface lay a quiet tension. Something unspoken that had lingered ever since the summer that changed everything. The summer when 15-year-old Lacey Whitmore vanished on her walk home from choir practice. Her blonde hair still damp with sweat from the humid July air. Her last known words to her best friend being, "I'll be fine, it's just a 10-minute walk." But 10 minutes turned into 30, then into hours, and by morning, the townspeople had begun combing the woods with flashlights and rifles, hoping to find a scared girl hiding. Not the brutal truth that would soon emerge, because 3 days later, her body was discovered just outside the county line. Hidden beneath a tangle of blackberry bushes near an old hunting trail, wrapped in a floral bedsheet like the kind sold at the local hardware store, her wrists bound with a fraying phone cord, and a rosary, hers, tucked into her palm. Her neck bore faint bruises, but there were no clear signs of assault, no fingerprints, no DNA, and the only clue, if you could call it that, was the fact that her shoes were missing. Not stolen, just gone, placed nowhere near the body, as if whoever killed her wanted her to be found but not fully understood. Ashwood froze, not just in fear, but in a kind of emotional paralysis, as if the truth would destroy the very fabric of their community. And so began the unraveling, not in violence but in silence. Neighbors stopped speaking, teenagers were kept home, church sermons grew darker, and rumors spread like wildfire. Some blamed out-of-towners, hitchhikers passing through on Route 7, others whispered about boys from the high school, or the reclusive Vietnam veteran who lived in a trailer outside town. But the sheriff, Clyde Warren, claimed it was likely a crime of opportunity, nothing to do with good Ashwood folk. And just like that, the investigation was wrapped in duct tape and stored in the evidence locker, case number 79 to 114, with more dust than documentation. The Whitmore family, once the golden-hearted hosts of the town's 4th of July picnic, withdrew from the community, selling their home the following year and leaving behind a grave marked by 2 angels and too many questions. Still, the town carried on as if carrying on was an obligation, but beneath the potlucks and harvest festivals, suspicion festered. There were those who knew more than they admitted, and those who had heard things they shouldn't have, like 14-year-old Ben Garrison, who told his older brother that he saw Lacey arguing with someone in a blue pickup truck near the edge of town that night, or Mrs. Eliza Monroe, the church secretary, who swore she saw blood on the steps of the rectory the morning after the murder, but both accounts were dismissed. Ben must have been mistaken, and Eliza, prone to imagination. Still, a few residents couldn't let it go, particularly a substitute teacher named Diane Foster, who had taught Lacey English the semester before and described her as sharp, spirited, and scared of something, though she couldn't say what, only that Lacey had recently asked for books on whistleblowers and had written a short story about a girl who saw something she wasn't supposed to. Diane brought her concerns to the sheriff, but was told to let the dead rest, a phrase that would come to define Ashwood's entire approach to truth. Bury it, bless it, and forget it. But as the years rolled on, forgetting proved harder than expected. More strange deaths followed, always ruled accidental or unrelated, yet undeniably eerie. Tommy Griggs, the janitor who claimed he saw Lacey's rosary earlier that week in the confessional booth, died in a house fire less than a year later. Marlene Dobbins, the grocery clerk who rang Lacey up the night she vanished, choked to death on a chicken bone at a Rotary Club dinner. Each incident chipped away at the idea that Ashwood's evil had been a one-time thing. Then, in the fall of 1995, nearly 2 decades later, a retired FBI agent named Calvin Hayes passed through town on his way to visit family in Missouri, and by coincidence or fate, stopped at a local garage after his car overheated. While waiting, he struck up a conversation with a mechanic who mentioned the girl in the woods. And Hayes, ever the investigator, asked questions. Too many, perhaps, because within hours of his inquiries, the town seemed to tighten. Conversations stopped when he walked by. His motel room was entered. While he was out, and a polite but firm visit from Sheriff Warren's son, now the acting sheriff, left him with the impression that this town didn't appreciate curiosity. But Hayes was undeterred, and what he found in old microfilm archives, local newsletters, and redacted police logs disturbed him. Missing evidence sheets, conflicting witness statements, and a death certificate for Lacey that listed the cause as undetermined trauma. A phrase that made his stomach turn. He quietly launched an unofficial reinvestigation, reaching out to surviving family members, former students, and retired law enforcement officers, many of whom were too afraid or too proud to speak. Yet Hayes compiled a file so thick it became a second casebook, containing newspaper clippings, timelines, photographs, and handwritten notes from those who wished to remain anonymous. Among them, a typed letter sent from Ashwood's now-defunct library address, signed only "The One Who Knows," that read, "She didn't scream because she knew him. She didn't run because she trusted him. And she died because she saw too much." With that chilling message, Hayes became convinced that Lacey's murder was part of something deeper, something that touched the roots of the town's institutions. The church, the police, the school, and possibly even the local government. His file, later dubbed the Hayes Report, would be leaked online in 2011, sparking renewed interest from cold case bloggers, amateur sleuths, and eventually a Netflix documentary proposal that never aired. But in 2025, with the rise of digital forensics and AI, reconstruction of missing evidence, interest surged again, and a new generation of investigators began pulling at the old threads of Ashwood's dark tapestry. And now, for the first time, you'll hear the full story, reconstructed from fragments, whispers, and hidden files, told not just as a mystery, but as a warning. Because the truth was never lost, only buried, in a place called Murderland. The sun had already dipped behind the ridge by the time Lacey Whitmore stepped out of the whitewashed church on Pine Hollow Road, the last notes of choir practice still echoing faintly in the sanctuary behind her as she adjusted the strap of her canvas book bag and waved goodbye to her friend Emily, who was being picked up by her older brother in their battered Ford truck. Lacey's hair, damp from the humid July air and the exertion of singing under flickering ceiling fans, clung softly to the sides of her face as she began the familiar walk home. A 10-minute stretch down a gravel road flanked by dense trees and shadowed farmhouses, the kind of route she'd taken hundreds of times before without a second thought. And yet that night, something was different, something she would never speak of but must have felt, because she hesitated briefly at the edge of the church lot, looking down the road like it led to somewhere she wasn't sure she should go. Her feet rooted for a moment too long before she took her first step into the dusk. A neighbor, Mr. Hildebrand, would later tell police he saw her pass his porch at 7:14 p.m., walking fast, head down, as if trying to avoid eye contact. Not unusual, perhaps, but enough for him to notice, enough for him to remember, because that would be the last confirmed sighting of her alive. Sometime between 7:15 and 7:40, Lacey vanished, and whatever happened in that window of time would remain a mystery that would haunt Ashwood for decades. But if one were to rewind that night, to slow down the shadows and listen closely to the whispers, certain details begin to emerge. Fragments, really, but enough to sketch the outlines of horror. Like the blue pickup truck parked beneath the sycamore tree near the old mill, engine running, windows rolled down, though no one ever admitted to seeing the driver, or the flickering streetlight on Juniper Lane that had been reported malfunctioning for weeks, creating a strobe-like effect that made anyone passing through feel like they were walking through a dream or a nightmare. And then there was the dog, a mutt named Max owned by the Paris family, who barked relentlessly between 7:20 and 7:30, facing the woods and growling low as if sensing something or someone, moving where no one should be. Lacey's usual route took her past all of these places, and while the sheriff later suggested she may have taken a shortcut through the field to avoid someone, or meet someone, no footprints were ever found, no signs of struggle reported, and yet, by 8 p.m., when her parents realized she wasn't home, panic had already set in, because Lacey was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. They called Emily, the church, even the Thompsons down the road, but no one had seen her. Just an empty path, a stillness in the air that felt too heavy, too unnatural. By 9 p.m., Sheriff Clyde Warren was notified, though he didn't initiate a search until morning, claiming she was likely with friends or upset over something. A statement that would be quoted with contempt for years to come. But those who lived closest to the road knew better, and a small group of neighbors began their own search with flashlights and rifles, walking through overgrown trails, calling her name into the trees, their voices swallowed by the thick, wet darkness of the Kentucky woods. What they didn't know, what no one could know at the time, was that less than 2 miles away, in a clearing just past Bear Creek Hollow, Lacey's body already lay beneath the blackberries, placed carefully, not thrown, posed almost like a warning or a ritual, though those words would never make it into the official report. The field where she was found had once been part of a hunting ground, long abandoned, and according to an old-timer named Willis Ray, who'd grown up hunting deer there as a boy, that specific spot had a name few remembered, Whisper's Edge, a place said to be cursed after a tragic barn fire in the 1930s that killed 2 brothers, but no one thought about that anymore. Not until it came up again in 1979. The forensic evidence collected at the scene was minimal. No blood trails, no broken branches, no torn clothing. Just the body, the bedsheet, the rosary, and the rope. Her face was calm, too calm, as if she hadn't struggled, as if she hadn't seen it coming, and that's what disturbed Sheriff Warren the most, though he would never admit it out loud. Autopsy reports, sparse and vague, listed cause of death as blunt trauma with possible asphyxiation. But the coroner was a friend of the sheriff's, and rumors swirled that pages were missing, that findings had been softened to protect someone important. At the same time, behind the scenes, tension simmered. A teacher quietly warned the school board that Lacey had been anxious in recent weeks, asking about whistleblower protections and referencing something she had seen through a window near the pastor's office. The church janitor, Tommy Griggs, told a drinking buddy that Lacey had been in the sanctuary late one evening, arguing in hushed tones with a man in a white shirt, possibly a deacon, but that statement never made it into any file. And then there was the anonymous tip that came into the station at 10:44 p.m. the night she went missing, a male voice, shaking, saying only, "Check the mill. Something happened at the old mill." Before hanging up, Sheriff Warren claimed the call was a prank, but phone logs proved it came from the payphone outside Whitman's pharmacy, 3 blocks from the church. The mill was never searched. Whether by negligence or deliberate omission, we may never know. But what is known is that Lacey's death fractured the town in ways that couldn't be seen until years later, the night casting a shadow that crept into marriages, friendships, and Sunday sermons. Secrets once whispered in corners became barbed wires of suspicion, and those who tried to speak out were dismissed, discredited, or quietly silenced, like Diane Foster, the substitute teacher who claimed Lacey had handed her a sealed envelope marked "Open if something happens." An envelope that mysteriously disappeared from Diane's desk the week after the funeral. There were so many moments that could have led to justice, to truth, to accountability, but one by one, they were missed, buried, or stolen, like Lacey's shoes, an odd detail that haunts every investigator who's looked into the case since. Because why take her shoes? Why leave everything else, even her jewelry, but not the shoes? Some believe it was symbolic, others say it was practical, to prevent tracking. But for those who knew her, it felt personal, intimate, as if the killer knew her well enough to understand what that small theft would mean. And so, on that humid July night, in the span of just 25 minutes, a girl full of dreams vanished from the world, and what should have launched a manhunt instead became a quiet funeral, a closed case, and a community-wide amnesia, a forgetting so complete it was as if Lacey had never walked those streets, never sung in that choir, never smiled at the boy in the third pew who cried at her funeral, and never spoke of her again. But time doesn't erase blood, and ghosts never truly rest, especially in places like Ashwood, where the wind still carries whispers down the gravel road Lacey walked that night, and the woods still remember the footsteps that never made it home. The investigation into Lacey Whitmore's murder began not with urgency, but with delay, indifference, and an undercurrent of quiet panic cloaked in small-town pride. As Sheriff Clyde Warren arrived at the scene nearly 12 hours after the girl's body was discovered by 2 volunteer searchers, retired postman Carl Bennett and his nephew Richie, who had veered off the official search grid and stumbled upon a patch of disturbed brush near the abandoned Bear Creek Trail. They hadn't expected to find anything, certainly not the twisted image of Lacey's lifeless body laid gently in the undergrowth, wrapped like a child's doll, untouched by the elements despite 3 full days missing, her skin pale and lips slightly parted, as if frozen mid-whisper. Sheriff Warren's initial reaction was to secure the area, but in reality, it was too late. By the time deputies arrived, at least a dozen townsfolk had already been to the site, contaminating the scene with footprints, cigarette butts, and curiosity. Crime scene tape was stretched haphazardly, evidence markers misplaced, and photos taken on outdated Polaroid cameras that were never properly cataloged, some even rumored to have been lost in the shuffle between the sheriff's office and the county lab. An office so underfunded that its lead technician doubled as a wildlife inspector and hadn't received formal forensic training since 1972. Meanwhile, Sheriff Warren insisted on keeping the investigation in-house, rejecting offers from the state police to assist, citing jurisdictional pride and a desire to not make a circus out of this tragedy. But insiders whispered that he was protecting someone who, exactly, was unclear, though theories began almost immediately. The first person questioned was Wayne Brewer, a loner and Vietnam vet who lived in a trailer off Redleaf Road and had a history of mental health issues. He was spotted near the church that night, talking to himself and collecting beer cans, but had no known connection to Lacey and no vehicle matching the blue pickup reported by young Ben Garrison. Nonetheless, he was brought in, interrogated for 6 hours, and quietly released after providing an alibi that, while flimsy, couldn't be disproven. Still, his reputation was permanently tarnished, and he moved out of town within weeks. Next came the focus on Lacey's social circle. Classmates, teachers, neighbors, all questioned, many intimidated, some outright threatened, especially those who contradicted the sheriff's narrative that the killer was an outsider, not one of our own, which quickly became the department's refrain, repeated in press statements and whispered behind closed doors. Yet inconsistencies mounted. Emily Carlton, Lacey's best friend, told deputies that Lacey had been acting strange in the days leading up to her death, avoiding certain people at church, carrying a notebook she refused to let anyone see, and once telling Emily, "If anything ever happens to me, tell them it wasn't an accident." A chilling premonition dismissed as teenage drama by investigators. When Diane Foster, the substitute teacher, brought forward the story of the envelope Lacey had entrusted her with, now mysteriously gone, the sheriff's office never followed up, and her name was notably absent from the official witness list filed weeks later. As for physical evidence, the rope used to bind Lacey's wrists was submitted to the county lab, but no fingerprints or fibers were recovered. At least, that's what the report said, though years later, a whistleblower named Janice Hobbs, who had briefly worked in records management, revealed that a second lab report existed. One that noted a partial print belonging to an unidentified adult male, and a hair sample that did not match the victim. Both reportedly destroyed in a clerical purge during an office remodel in 1981. The autopsy itself was performed by Dr. Harold Keene, an aging coroner with ties to the sheriff's family, who ruled the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, consistent with a fall or a single strike from a blunt object, and listed time of death as unknown, despite early searchers claiming the body felt cool to the touch and the lack of decomposition suggesting she had died only hours before being found, not days. This discrepancy raised eyebrows, especially among those who believed Lacey had been held somewhere before being killed, perhaps drugged, perhaps restrained, and then staged in the clearing to delay discovery. When Calvin Hayes, the retired FBI agent, began digging into the case decades later, he discovered a handwritten log dated July 17, 1979, 2 days after Lacey went missing, describing unusual activity reported by a farmer near the abandoned mill. Lights on in the upper loft, strange sounds after dark, and tire tracks leading into the back entrance. This log was never submitted as evidence, never followed up, and when Hayes tried to verify it through county archives, the page was missing. Perhaps most disturbing was the lack of recorded interviews with Lacey's pastor, Reverend Thomas Bell, a man whom multiple sources later claimed had been seen speaking with Lacey alone several times in the weeks leading up to her death, including the night of choir practice, but who was never formally questioned, despite being one of the last adults to see her. His name appears only once, scribbled in the margin of a deputy's notebook, next to the words Lacey's envelope, a reference to the letter Diane Foster claimed existed. By 1980, less than a year after Lacey's murder, the case was effectively cold, filed away in a drawer marked unsolved, with no suspects, no further leads, and no intention of reopening it. Official statements referred to it as a tragedy, but without conclusive direction, and Sheriff Warren, when pressed by local reporters, insisted that sometimes evil comes and goes without warning, a sentiment that comforted no one but seemed to satisfy the town's collective desire to move on. Yet not everyone was willing to forget. Lacey's cousin, Hannah Whitmore, a freshman at a nearby college at the time, began collecting news clippings, organizing notes, and taping recorded conversations with those who would talk, slowly building her own casebook out of grief and frustration, though it too would vanish. Her home was broken into in 1983, her files rifled through, and her tape recorder smashed. No items stolen, no suspects identified. It was only decades later, when Hayes took over the unofficial investigation, that her notes resurfaced. Mailed anonymously in a brown envelope to his home in Georgia, along with a single photograph. A blurry image of Lacey at choir practice, sitting beside a man in a white dress shirt, his face half turned away, but his hands unmistakably clenched into fists. Who took the photo, and how it survived, remains a mystery, but it reignited interest, and Hayes's meticulous cross-referencing of dates, names, and overlooked tips revealed a disturbing pattern. A cluster of girls from neighboring towns who had gone missing between 1976 and 1982, all between the ages of 14 and 17, all with some connection, however slight, to church-affiliated youth groups, and all from towns where the same traveling revival preacher had passed through, Reverend Bell. While correlation is not causation, the chilling possibility of a predator hiding in plain sight, under the veil of God and trust, was enough to convince Hayes that the original investigation had been a cover-up, intentional or not, and that Lacey had become collateral damage in a web of complicity stretching beyond Ashwood's borders. The Hayes report, as it came to be known, outlined every failure of the original investigation. Missing files, ignored tips, false assumptions, and, perhaps most damning of all, the deliberate erasure of those who dared ask questions. Yet even as the report gained traction online, the town remained silent, clinging to its version of events like armor, refusing to confront the ghosts it had buried. Because in Ashwood, silence wasn't just a habit. It was a survival tactic. To understand the murder of Lacey Whitmore is to first understand who she truly was beyond the sepia-toned newspaper clippings and fading memorial candles that became her legacy. Lacey wasn't just another small-town girl. She was magnetic, perceptive, and profoundly misunderstood. A 16-year-old whose eyes held an awareness that unsettled adults and intrigued her peers. A girl raised on church hymns and diner milkshakes, but who dreamed of escaping Ashwood for something bigger, something unnamed, and shimmering just beyond the county line. Her mother, Eileen, described her as restless, like she could hear things the rest of us didn't. And her father, Sam, a quiet mechanic who never fully recovered from his daughter's death, once confided to a local reporter that Lacey had a habit of disappearing into the woods with a sketchbook, where she'd draw people she imagined living far away in cities she'd only seen on television. In school, she kept mostly to herself, excelling in English but skipping math, doodling poetry in the margins of her notebooks. Her favorite line, scrawled repeatedly, was, "I am not what they see." A chilling echo in hindsight. Those close to her described a girl living in two worlds: the obedient churchgoer who sang angelic solos in choir, and the questioning rebel who once left a note in her locker that read, "Faith without questions is just fear dressed up." She had recently begun volunteering at the local library, and according to Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian had taken out several books on psychology, trauma, and survival within weeks of her death. Odd choices for a teen, unless she was trying to decode something or someone around her. And then there were her interactions with adults, especially men, which now carry unsettling undertones in the clarity of hindsight. Reverend Bell, for one, was said to have taken a particular spiritual interest in Lacey, often calling her into his office for private prayer, and once giving her a leather-bound journal to write her truths. A journal never recovered. And then there was Coach Tim Reynolds, a charismatic young gym teacher in his late 20s, known for his friendly demeanor and tight-knit relationships with female students. His name came up twice in Hannah's notes, once as someone Lacey reportedly avoided in the hallways, and once in a letter Lacey wrote to her cousin just weeks before her death, stating cryptically, "Some people wear masks even when they pray." Other students speculated about a possible relationship, but no concrete evidence ever surfaced. Coach Reynolds would later move to another district and never speak publicly about the case. Beyond these adults, suspicion also fell on peers, especially the boys who orbited around Lacey with the confused intensity of adolescence. Chief among them was Caleb Monroe, the son of a prominent businessman, who had briefly dated Lacey during junior year and was reportedly furious when she ended things abruptly. Classmates described their breakup as ugly, with Caleb allegedly spreading rumors about her and even confronting her at church youth group one night in a shouting match that ended with Lacey in tears and Caleb being escorted out by Pastor Bell himself. Caleb denied any wrongdoing and provided an alibi for the night of her disappearance. He claimed he was at a bonfire party miles away, but no photos or confirmations ever truly locked down his whereabouts for the full night. Then there was Jacob, J.J. Franklin, a shy boy who had long harbored an unspoken crush on Lacey, often leaving poems in her locker signed with a single J. He had no criminal record, but years later would be arrested for stalking an ex-girlfriend, a detail Hayes found strikingly consistent with obsessive behavior. JJ was never officially questioned beyond a single informal sit-down with a deputy, during which he cried and claimed he just wanted her to be happy. Another name that appeared more than once in Hayes's files was Deacon Mark Rutledge, an older man in his 40s who worked closely with the church youth group and was known for organizing overnight retreats. Lacey's attendance at one such retreat, 3 weeks before her death, was corroborated by multiple people, but when asked what had occurred during the trip, nearly all the girls who went became silent or evasive, their eyes darting and voices trembling, a group trauma unspoken. Rutledge had no prior accusations against him, but mysteriously moved to another state less than a month after Lacey's funeral, citing family reasons, and refused all contact with investigators afterward. Reverend Bell defended him publicly, calling him a man of God whose character should never be questioned, a defense that now rings more like concealment. Perhaps most tragically, Lacey had tried to speak, subtly, in the ways young victims often do, through symbols, hints, coded language. Her drawings in the library archives featured disturbing imagery. A girl with her mouth sewn shut, hands reaching from behind pews, a figure in white looming over a cross that dripped not blood, but ink. Yet these were dismissed as teen angst, and only in the aftermath did they begin to resemble a desperate call for help. Hannah's notes suggested Lacey was compiling a list, a journal of names and patterns, but that list was never found, only referenced in a letter that said, "If anything happens, look under the floorboard in the choir room. There's truth hidden." In the wood, a location checked years later by Hayes, only to find the floorboard replaced during renovations, the church denying any records of when or why. As for the suspects, none were charged, none detained, and most faded back into Ashwood's polite obscurity, shielded by time and small-town denial. Yet Hayes's investigation unearthed fragments. Police logs mentioning a person of interest never named, anonymous tips ignored, and a curious number of missing or altered files from 1979 through 1981, all relating to minors involved in church events. One redacted document, partially recovered through FOIA requests, included a handwritten note reading, "Don't dig too deep. Some graves hold more than bones." A chilling metaphor, or perhaps a warning. Lacey Whitmore was not just a victim. She was a mirror held up to a community that prized appearances over truth, comfort over confrontation, and her story, once buried beneath shame and secrecy, now flickers like candlelight in the darkness, illuminating the faces of those who may still walk free, holding secrets behind Sunday smiles. Ashwood was the kind of town that made postcards feel inadequate. Neatly painted porches, tulip beds that bloomed in sync, 4th of July parades where toddlers waved tiny flags from hay-covered floats, and whispers so finely woven into everyday conversation that they became indistinguishable from the air itself. It was a town where time had a strange elasticity, stretching out summer afternoons like molasses and folding tragedies neatly into corners no one swept. A place where people preferred their wounds to scar over in silence rather than speak the truth aloud. In the years following Lacey Whitmore's murder, Ashwood seemed to collectively inhale and then refuse to exhale, as if holding its breath would keep the rot from spreading. Life, on the surface, resumed its rhythm. The church bells still rang, the high school football team still lost in the semifinals, and the diner still served Miss June's famous cherry pie with a side of gossip and passive aggression. But beneath the routine, there was a coldness, a quiet rearrangement of memory that slowly edited Lacey out of the town's narrative. Her yearbook photo remained, but the dedication page in the school auditorium was quietly removed during renovations. Her name was rarely spoken at church, and the local newspaper, which had once published nearly 24 articles on her case in just a year, failed to mention her even on the 10-year anniversary of her death. It was as if forgetting her had become a civic duty, way of preserving the fragile illusion of peace, because remembering meant reckoning, and reckoning meant exposing not just a killer, but the culture that enabled silence. Neighbors who once attended candlelight vigils now shrugged and said, "It was a long time ago," or "We just want to move on," as if the act of remembering would somehow invite darkness back through the doors they had sealed with prayer and denial. New families moved in, unaware of the shadows their white picket fences were built upon, and longtime residents simply never brought it up. Children weren't told, teachers avoided the topic, and those who still had questions were subtly shunned as if curiosity were a form of betrayal. Even the police department, now run by a younger generation who'd grown up beneath the weight of the case, had developed a silent policy of non-engagement. Files went untouched, evidence decayed in basement boxes, and when independent journalist Jordan Hayes came knocking decades later, she was met with forced smiles and locked filing cabinets. The mayor at the time, Ronald Booker, issued a public statement praising Ashwood for resilience in the face of hardship, while privately warning town officials that digging into the past only opens old wounds and legal liabilities. But beneath the town's collective amnesia, there were flickers of resistance. Hannah Monroe, Lacey's childhood friend turned local history teacher, kept a hidden wall of clippings and timelines in her attic, and every year on the anniversary of Lacey's death, she left a single yellow daffodil on the school steps, a flower no one ever saw her place. Others remembered in quieter ways. Mrs. Jenkins, the librarian, who preserved Lacey's marginalia in a locked drawer labeled "Don't Forget," and old Mr. Abbott, the janitor, who never stopped asking new officers if the case had been reopened. And then there were those who remembered but chose to distort. Reverend Bell, who occasionally referenced Lacey as a troubled soul taken too soon by temptation, subtly reframing her as a cautionary tale rather than a victim. He would later be implicated in financial fraud and quietly relocated. His church leadership defended by an elder board that cited spiritual warfare as the true enemy. Even Caleb Monroe, once a prime suspect, became a successful realtor and father of 3, quoted in a local magazine as saying, "Ashwood is where the past stays in the past, and that's what makes it special." A sentiment that read like confession to those who knew better. What became clear to Hayes as she dug deeper was that the town's ability to forget wasn't passive. It was deliberate, constructed, maintained like a garden of half-truths and manicured stories. She discovered that records from 1979 to 1981 had not just gone missing but had been systematically misfiled under unrelated categories: juvenile truancy logs, zoning permits, outdated weather reports, as if someone had tried to bury the truth in plain sight. One of the most chilling discoveries was an audio recording made in 1980 by Deputy Mark Travers, who had since passed away, in which he said, "I think we know who did it, but if we press, the whole damn church might come down with him, and people here would rather keep their faith than face the facts." That tape had never been submitted as evidence. Hayes found it mislabeled in a donated box from a retired officer's garage, another casualty of the town's coordinated forgetfulness. What haunted Hayes most, however, was the realization that the deeper she dug, the more resistance she faced. Not from strangers, but from people who claimed to want closure. Some begged her to stop, others threatened lawsuits, and one anonymous letter warned, "You keep chasing ghosts, one day they'll chase you back." Still, the stories continued to surface. Whispers from nursing homes, anonymous tips from guilt-ridden elders, notes slipped into library books, each one pulling at the carefully threaded seams of the town's memory. And through it all, the landscape itself seemed complicit. Those woods where Lacey's body was found remained unnaturally quiet, the trees older now but just as watchful, the ground still holding its secrets beneath layers of fallen leaves and unspoken truths. Hayes visited that clearing one October morning, recording ambient sounds for her report, and stood in the silence until a train passed miles away and birds scattered. Not from her presence, but from something else, some shift in the air, as if the earth itself stirred at the memory of what it had witnessed. In that moment, she realized Ashwood hadn't truly forgotten. Ashwood had chosen to forget, and in doing so had trapped itself in a purgatory of pretend peace, forever haunted not just by a murder, but by the truth it refused to face. The truth has a way of surviving, beneath layers of dust, behind false walls, buried in attics, sealed inside forgotten lockers and mislabeled boxes in basements where time has slowed but never stopped. And for Jordan Hayes, the question was no longer whether the town of Ashwood had hidden something, but how deep the cover-up went and how many hands were dirted in the process. It started with a list, a handwritten index she found inside a 1980 field notebook marked Storm Damage May, which, on the surface, appeared irrelevant until she flipped the page and saw, in faint pencil, a series of case file numbers that didn't correspond to any public record of the investigation into Lacey Whitmore's death. Each file code was linked to either a location, like Cedar Hill Storage B12, or a name, including T. Merrick, who had served as evidence clerk for the Ashwood PD until 1984 before resigning suddenly, citing personal stress. That name turned out to be a goldmine of suppressed leads and procedural red flags, because Merrick's departure aligned with the mysterious disappearance of multiple physical evidence logs, and when Hayes tracked down his daughter in a neighboring town, she revealed something extraordinary. A locked footlocker her father had kept hidden in their barn loft for over 40 years, which she'd never opened out of fear and unresolved grief. Inside, Hayes found what could only be described as a time capsule of suppressed truth. Photos marked, "Not for court." Blood-stained cassette tape, burned edges of a journal belonging to Lacey's best friend Anna Lynn, who had died in a car accident in 1982 under questionable circumstances. And most disturbingly, an envelope containing 6 undeveloped film negatives with the label "Night Before Dave's Truck, Do Not Show Press." She took the contents to an independent forensic lab, which confirmed the negatives were from a late 1970s camera model, and what they revealed chilled her. Lacey, visibly anxious, seated in the passenger side of a brown pickup that matched the one owned by Caleb Monroe's cousin, Doug, a man who had never once been mentioned in any report. Worse, in the background of one shot, the town pastor's son, a then 17-year-old with a sealed juvenile record, appeared blurred but recognizable near the service station outside town limits where Lacey had reportedly been seen hours before her death. This one photograph appended the entire case timeline and exposed what Hayes would come to call the Second Circle, a small, tight-knit group of individuals either directly involved in or protecting the killer through coordinated misinformation, obstruction, and outright tampering. She began to piece together how Doug Monroe left Ashwood just 2 days after the murder, relocating to Montana under a new last name, funded quietly by a family trust that didn't exist on any tax record prior to 1980. His property records listed an attorney, John C. Pierce, who was known locally for handling delicate matters involving church and civic leadership. Pierce, now retired, denied all involvement when Hayes confronted him, but later that week, her car was broken into while she slept at a motel in Fairview, and only one thing was taken: the envelope of developed photocopies she had intended to submit to an investigative podcast series. Undeterred, Hayes doubled down, cross-referencing land sales, medical records, and archived funeral announcements to uncover a disturbing pattern. 3 men listed as witnesses in the original 1979 case had all died within 18 months of each other in freak accidents. A boating incident, a barn collapse, and a gas leak, none of which were investigated as suspicious at the time. But when autopsy reports were obtained through legal channels, Hayes noticed a glaring inconsistency. All 3 men showed signs of recent physical injury inconsistent with the cause of death: bruised ribs, broken knuckles, and in one case, trace amounts of chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative once used in truth serum interrogations during Cold War-era military programs. Someone had not just buried evidence, they had eliminated it, person by person, file by file. Back in Ashwood, Hayes quietly entered the closed-down municipal storage site, Cedar Hill B12, using a code found scribbled inside Merrick's notebook margin, and what she found was shocking. Shelves of unprocessed evidence from dozens of local crimes between 1975 to 1982, all marked inactive with no digital copies in the state system, including a box labeled Whitmore Case X, containing Lacey's clothing from the night of the murder, sealed in deteriorating plastic, one broken fingernail, and a hair sample tagged unknown male, reject batch. This sample, when tested against modern DNA databases, yielded a familial match, not to Caleb Monroe, as once suspected, but to Reverend Samuel Bell's nephew, Joseph Bell, who had left Ashwood abruptly in 1983 to pursue missionary work in Honduras, only to resurface in Arizona 30 years later under a new church-funded identity. Confronted with this finding, the Ashwood PD issued a carefully worded press release stating the DNA did not conclusively match any known perpetrator and declined to reopen the case. Without clear prosecutorial intent, a move Hayes described on air as a betrayal not just of justice, but of every citizen who ever believed in due process. She compiled her findings into a private digital archive, sharing access with a select group of true crime journalists and legal advocates, one of whom, retired FBI profiler Clarice Wren, stated flatly, "This is a textbook cover-up. Small town, social power hierarchy, multiple complicit actors, and a collective psychological investment in forgetting." As Hayes' series gained traction online, downloads soared into the hundreds of thousands, and whistleblowers from Ashwood began to send anonymous tips. One included a digitized 911 call from the night of Lacey's disappearance, previously believed lost, in which a panicked female voice gasps, "He said nobody would believe me? He said he'd already made the sheriff promise to make it go away," before the line cuts out. This audio, paired with a 1979 sheriff's ledger showing a handwritten note, "Case closed, higher orders," became the smoking gun Hayes needed to bring national attention to what had long been dismissed as local tragedy. She filed a civil suit under the Freedom of Information Act and began work on a full-length documentary titled Ashwood, The Evidence They Buried. But even as the walls of silence began to crack, resistance grew. Her podcast was hacked, false rumors were spread, and a local church group launched a smear campaign accusing her of satanic destabilization, echoing the paranoia of the satanic panic era that had once gripped Ashwood in the early 80s. Yet the facts were undeniable now, and Hayes knew that what had been buried could no longer be ignored. The evidence had surfaced, the lies had unraveled, and the truth, after 46 years, was louder than the silence that had once smothered it. What remained now was not whether justice could be served, but whether Ashwood, a town built on forgetting, could survive remembering. There comes a moment in every buried truth where silence fractures. Not in dramatic courtroom revelations or televised confessions, but in quiet, irreparable cracks that show up in people, systems, and stories that no longer hold under the weight of what they've concealed. And in Ashwood, that moment began with a sound. The muffled scream of a survivor who no longer wished to remain anonymous, a voice long ignored finally pushing through decades of self-protection and fear. Her name was Valerie Keene, now in her late 60s, who once lived just 2 doors down from Lacey Whitmore and had always been described in old neighborhood letters as a quiet girl with too many secrets and an absent father. But when she reached out to Jordan Hayes through an encrypted email thread with the subject line, "I heard her die," everything the town had believed or had been forced to believe began to collapse. Valerie revealed she had been in the woods near Miller's Trail the night of the murder, hiding from her stepfather after another violent outburst, and had heard 2 sets of male voices yelling before a single scream echoed, followed by silence and the unmistakable thud of something heavy hitting wet ground. She never told anyone, not even when she saw blood on her shoes the next day, because by morning, the official story had already taken hold. Caleb Monroe had confessed under pressure. The sheriff's department had everything under control. And any deviation from that script was met with suspicion, threats, or worse. But now, for decades later, Valerie was dying, stage 4 lung cancer, and said she couldn't carry the silence to her grave. Hayes recorded Valerie's testimony in 3 long sittings, each session growing heavier, not just with grief but with specific details that had never been made public. The scent of gasoline lingering in the air, the description of a blue varsity jacket with a bloodied shoulder, not belonging to Monroe, and a boy she saw running from the scene with a church choir badge on his collar. This confession aligned almost perfectly with the recently unearthed evidence from Chapter 6, prompting Hayes to push harder for legal re-examination. But that's when the backlash hit full force. Her name smeared across local radio stations, threats slipped under her motel door, and a once friendly Ashwood historian suddenly refused to speak to her for his own safety. Even her podcast listeners began to notice. Episodes were suddenly missing. Strange glitches in playback and vague terms of service violations flagged her true crime archive site. But instead of backing down, Hayes went national, granting an exclusive interview to the New York Ledger titled "The Town That Tried to Forget." And that piece blew everything open. Within 72 hours, 3 separate whistleblowers came forward. One a retired evidence officer, one a former nurse from the county morgue, and one, shockingly, a woman who identified herself only as Ruth, the sister of Doug Monroe, who confessed that her brother had returned home the night of Lacey's death covered in scratches and shaking, whispering, "It wasn't supposed to go that far. They said she'd just listen." Ruth never reported it because the sheriff had already visited their home the next morning and told the family, "It's all been taken care of," words that would later appear in 3 other testimonials collected by Hayes from people too afraid to go on record. The town of Ashwood was reaching its breaking point, not because of outsiders or gossip, but because the lie that had held it together for 46 years was unraveling from the inside, pulled apart by the very people it had been built to protect. Meanwhile, the DNA sample from Chapter 6 had been quietly reanalyzed by a lab in Denver and returned a familial match not just to Joseph Bell, but to Samuel Bell himself, the beloved local reverend, now in his 80s and suffering from dementia, who had long preached forgiveness while shielding what may have been the ugliest truth of all, that his own blood had been involved in a murder, and that he had wielded his position to bury it. A quiet arrest warrant was issued for Joseph Bell under a false identity in Arizona, and while authorities said he resisted and attempted to flee, he was taken into custody with a sealed indictment that included charges of obstruction, accessory to murder, and evidence tampering. For Ashwood, it was the moment the mirror shattered. Town council meetings devolved into shouting matches, old alliances collapsed, and protesters stood outside the courthouse holding signs that read, "Justice delayed is justice denied," while others clung desperately to the old narrative, calling Hayes a liar, a witch, even accusing her of desecrating sacred history. The final fracture came when a grand jury was convened in the state capitol, not in Ashwood, to avoid bias, and multiple sealed testimonies were reviewed, including Valerie Keene's, which Hayes had preserved through affidavit before Valerie passed away just weeks after her final interview. Her dying words captured on tape, "Don't let them bury me with this weight. Let the world know she didn't die in vain." And so, with the veil lifted, with the audio, the DNA, the photos, the journal scraps, the sworn testimony, and the courage of a few who refused to remain silent, Ashwood finally crossed the line between a myth and a reckoning, between the lies it told and the truth it couldn't outrun. What came next was no longer a question of guilt, but of memory, responsibility, and whether a town that had once chosen silence could now bear the roar of truth echoing through every street, every church pew, every unmarked file cabinet that had once whispered, "Forget her." But the world hadn't forgotten, and neither had justice. Justice doesn't always arrive in the form of sirens. handcuffs, and courtroom applause. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in an old woman's dying breath, a yellowed photo found behind a wall, a voice memo played for the first time in 4 decades, or the trembling hand of a man finally signing a confession no one ever thought would exist. And in Ashwood, justice came not as a single moment, but a slow tidal wave crashing over generations of silence, beginning with Joseph Bell's indictment and spiraling outward into the lives of every person who had ever believed the lie. As the grand jury testimony went public, so did the suppressed documents, photocopies of falsified reports, missing timeline entries, a damning photo of the sheriff playing poker with Samuel Bell on the very night he claimed to be searching the woods. And as the evidence spread like wildfire across podcasts, TikToks, YouTube exposés, and late-night news, Ashwood was forced into the national spotlight it had long avoided, becoming the subject of think pieces, Netflix inquiries, and academic studies on collective silence. Former students of Lacey Whitmore, who had gone on to live ordinary lives under extraordinary weight, began submitting poems, essays, and memorials to online archives in her name, while an independent nonprofit named the Lacey Project was launched by none other than Jordan Hayes herself, aiming to reopen other cold cases in forgotten towns across America. Meanwhile, the retired sheriff, too frail to stand trial, gave a closed-door deposition admitting to evidence suppression for the greater good and expressing no remorse, while Doug Monroe, long presumed a tragic scapegoat, had his name officially cleared by the state attorney general in a live press conference that left his sister Ruth sobbing uncontrollably on stage, holding up a childhood photo of them by a fishing dock, saying, "He was never a monster. He was a boy who trusted the wrong people." The moment shook the country, not just because of what happened, but because it reflected something deeply American. The small towns with smiling faces and dark basements, the institutions built to protect but often used to hide, and the generational grief passed down not through genes but through secrets. Valerie Keene's tapes, now preserved by the Library of Congress, were declared a landmark oral history in the fight against institutional cover-ups, and her voice, frail, haunting, clear, was replayed at vigils on radio stations and even in a Broadway play titled Murderland, which sold out in under a week. But perhaps the most unforgettable moment came when Jordan Hayes returned to the woods, those same woods from Chapter 2, with Lacey's surviving cousin and a camera crew, standing under the old oak where the body was found, reading aloud a letter written by Lacey 2 days before her death. A school essay titled "What Makes a Hero?" in which the 16-year-old girl wrote, "A hero is someone who does what's right even when it costs them everything. Someone who breaks the silence when the silence is too loud." The words rang like prophecy, a message frozen in time, now carried into the world by millions who had never known her name just months earlier. In the end, no one walked away whole. Ashwood lost its innocence, families lost their illusions, and Hayes lost the anonymity she once clung to. But the truth had been unearthed, and in its place grew something stronger: accountability, awareness, a resolve to never again look away when the signs are there. New laws were proposed in Lacey's name, requiring mandatory preservation of small-town evidence logs and third-party oversight in suspicious juvenile cases. And while politicians debated their passage, the cultural tide had already turned. Podcasts that once whispered about Ashwood now shouted, documentaries lined up interviews with every living witness, and true crime. Forums hosted live AMAs with the investigation team. People wanted to know not just what happened, but how it had stayed hidden so long, how the story of one murdered teenager became a lens into the American soul. And so the echoes of justice didn't stop at indictments or apologies. They became part of the collective memory, etched into books, classrooms, activism, and dinner table conversations across the nation. In the very last scene of the final documentary, we see a plaque installed at the edge of Miller's Trail, surrounded by flowers and photographs, engraved with the words, "This is where the silence ended, in memory of Lacey Whitmore, 1963 to 1979. She was never forgotten." And as the wind rustles through the trees, as children play nearby with no idea of the history beneath their feet, we're reminded that justice isn't just about answers. It's about reckoning, about facing what we buried, and choosing, again and again, to speak the truth even when it shakes the ground we stand on. And so, as the final chapter closes on this long-forgotten case, one thing becomes clear: Murderland was never just a place on a map. It was a silence that echoed across generations, a truth buried beneath layers of fear, pride, and protection. But truth has a heartbeat, and once you listen closely enough, you can hear it, beating through every redacted file, every voice that was once dismissed, every name etched in memory. Lacey Whitmore never got to tell her story, but through the voices of those who remembered her, those who risked everything to dig deeper, and those who refused to let her case fade into history, she speaks. And her voice has become louder than the silence ever was. Thank you for listening to Murderland, secrets that time couldn't bury. If the story moved you, share it, talk about it. And above all, remember, justice isn't something we wait for. It's something we build, together, piece by piece, truth by truth. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and never stop asking questions.